Welcome on behalf of Ashden and of Christian Aid. My name is Valentin. I'm the International Director at Christian Aid, and I am your host this afternoon. Also a special word of thanks to Simmons & Simmons, who are hosting us for this event where we launch the results of a research report that we've done jointly on urgent issues of alternative and affordable pro-poor energy. So, for me to introduce this event, of course, I think we are all here because we know that a lack of energy to affordable modern energy for those in the developing world is a factor that keeps families in poverty and slows economic development. Energy is not a luxury. It is an essential. And energy poverty hinders the provision of healthcare and education. It forces people to cook over open fires or inefficient stoves with all the healthcare issues that arise from that. And people in rural areas are often the most affected by energy poverty. I can relate a situation when I started my career, that's now a long time ago, working with farmers in Kenya, some of whom lost their land to a hydroelectric plant. With the promise of energy. I visited 25 years later, they still hadn't received the energy, but they did lose their land. So it's often the poor and remote areas that pay the price for energy generation, but are not necessarily the ones to benefit. And more recently in my role with Christian Aid, I've seen firsthand both the problems as well as the impact of actually addressing energy poverty. I can relate to you a trip I made 2 years ago to India. I was in Jharkhand in central east, northeast India, where we are working in tribal communities and we are introducing the solar lantern, which was actually the Ashden winner for that year, the d.light lamp. It's a great product, the 100th object in history of the world in 100 objects. That was the d.light lamp, the solar lantern. Great solution for people in poverty, and I spent a day in the community and including an evening in that community where people were showing me the benefits of their solar lanterns, and the benefits were many. Children doing their homework, women saying they felt safe because when they had to go out to take little kids to the toilet, they weren't afraid of stepping on snakes, and also just the improvement of the home environment, which was remarkable because of no longer having the kerosene fumes. I'm telling this story also because it illustrates some of the problems. The project was not a raving success. It was great in the community. It was a wonderful technical solution, but to achieve scale we had underestimated not just the geographical distance between Delhi and Jharkhand, but we had underestimated the cultural, the social, the political and other aspects that made actually getting the supply chain to work all the way to the tribal villages of Jharkhand quite a challenge. So instead of getting tens of thousands of lamps to the villages through a microfinance scheme, we managed to get thousands of lamps to the villages, which was all right, but not what we hoped for. And I think that brings me to the core of the essence of the issue that we want to present to you today. Technical solutions are increasingly available. There's a lot of developments in alternative energy. Solar has taken off. Other technical solutions are there. But too often, good technical solutions fail because a supportive infrastructure is not there, or indeed, as we will see from the research, because the finance that is required for a basic market-based solution is not there, or is not there at the right time, or indeed the money may be there, but the support and the technical advice and things like that are not available. So it is with that in mind that Ashden and Christian Aid commissioned a piece of work, and the research that we are presenting to you this afternoon is based on interview with leaders of energy access enterprises. It has identified how best we, donors, technical assistance providers, investors, policymakers, influencers, can enable energy enterprises to thrive. We know from experience that getting support right does make a difference. The report refers to the examples of, for example, Sunny Money and Barefoot Power, where the right kind of support at the right time not only transformed each enterprise, but significantly increased their contribution to the ending of energy poverty. With that, I would like to hand over to Emily.
I'm going to present the key findings from the research. I'm not going to go into detail in the recommendations for how these findings can be incorporated and used to inform work, as that will be the basis of the panel discussion to follow. So I'll just do a brief overview of the key findings. I'm also not going to go into detail into the methodology, how we did the research. That's all in the report for you if you want to know more about it. So as Paul said, lack of access to modern energy is a huge problem for people around the world, and enterprises are working to solve this problem by delivering energy products and services to the people who need them. Many of us in this room, including Ashden and Christian Aid, work with these types of enterprises to help them survive and grow. But in order to inform our support programmes and make sure they're as effective as possible, Ashden and Christian Aid wanted to develop a more systematic understanding of the types of support these enterprises need and how it can best be designed and executed to be as helpful as possible. So as Paul said, this research is based on interviews with energy access enterprises, which you can see here. The only one of these which is not listed in a map in the beginning of your report is Stuff International, which ceased trading last year. Most of these enterprises are delivering either electricity through solar, so small solar lanterns through to large systems, or clean cooking solutions. We also interviewed some providers of support, which you can see listed on the right-hand side. So the first thing we did was ask the enterprises what support they had received and who from, which you can see here. This is obviously not a table that explains absolutely all the possibilities, but this is the experiences that were given to us. So you can see that the support provided fell broadly into two categories: finance and technical assistance. Finance covering everything from grants, loan guarantees, social and commercial investment, and carbon finance, and technical assistance ranging from consultancy to education. And then down the side you can see the providers, so the organisations that were providing this support, ranging from trusts to educational organisations. So in order to help us answer the big question of how can we best support these types of enterprises, we break it down into 4 sub-questions, which are: what types of support do these enterprises need? What are the characteristics of successful support? What organisational characteristics indicate that an enterprise is likely to be able to make use of this support? And what other factors, non-support related factors, influence these enterprises' ability to survive and grow? So just looking at these first and second questions to begin with, we can look at finance and technical assistance separately. So the enterprises shared many experiences of receiving financial support with us. However, in spite of this, we did find that there was a huge unmet need for financing of all types, but this was particularly the case for working capital. So enterprises told us stories of being starved of working capital, lurching from cash flow crisis to cash flow crisis, and also of having to make decisions that were bad for profit margins because of not having enough cash. So for example, not being able to buy in bulk and take advantage of discounts. Speed also emerged as a factor in experiences that were either not successful or could have been better, with finance taking over 2.5 years to come through in some cases. This is particularly important because delays impose extra costs on organisations. For example, one enterprise told us that they missed out on other financing opportunities because they had spent so long doing the due diligence for one investment. Factors for success in the experiences that the enterprises shared were a straightforward process before receiving the finance, from application through to receiving the money, and afterwards a reporting burden which doesn't impose too great costs on the receiving organisation in terms of both time and capacity, and where applicable, reasonable interest rates and not having need for collateral. So moving on to technical assistance, there were many and varied instances of technical assistance that the enterprises shared with us. Some key unmet needs that came up several times were specifically for impartial advice, so not provided by somebody who has a particular interest in a particular product or service, on firstly reaching investment readiness and then also accessing appropriate finance. Sales and marketing support came up as a very important area. Those organisations which had received support in this area found it really transformational. Those that had received good support in this area found it really transformational, and several found that they needed more support in this area, which they weren't able to find. Common factors for success were when a business mentor or a consultant was placed with an organisation, the fact that that person had not only the right expertise but the right experience. It does sound obvious, but it is a very niche sector, and it can be sort of tempting to compromise on this, but it was highlighted as a key factor. The duration of the support. So in instances where a business mentor was placed full-time with an organisation, those that we collected which lasted 2 or 3 weeks were not successful. Those which lasted 2 or 3 months were. So our results do indicate that 2 months is a sort of minimum time if this sort of technical assistance is to be successful. We asked the enterprises who paid for the technical assistance and tried to see if this was linked to success. There is a common view that in order for the receiving organisation to really be committed to the support experience, they must make a financial contribution. However, while we found that while the experiences where the enterprise did pay were all successful, there were also very high rates of success where the support was given pro bono. So the results do indicate that it's not always necessary for the receiving enterprise to make a financial contribution in order for the support to be successful. So moving on to the third question, what factors indicate, what characteristics indicate that an enterprise is likely to be able to be a good investment of resources in this area? We asked support providers what things they look for when they're looking at making an investment or working with an energy access enterprise. Key themes that came up in this area were management capacity, as indicated by, for example, a level of appropriate education or a track record of success in running similar ventures, and also senior level commitment to the support activity. So, for example, this was backed up by one of the enterprises themselves, who said that their support that they received in sales and marketing would have been much more successful from the beginning if they'd had the whole senior management team involved and brought into the process right from the start. So moving on to the final question, what other factors influence these enterprises' ability to survive and grow, not related to support? The main issue that came up many times was staffing. So that's both being able to find the right staff and retain them. Also mentioned were national level policies such as taxes and import duties. Very few enterprises mentioned customer purchasing power as a barrier, which was surprising for us, given that, given the kind of products these enterprises are selling and who they're selling them to. One of the reasons that this might be the case is that most of the enterprises were either selling low-value goods, not low-value, low-cost goods, such as solar lanterns, or higher-cost goods, but also offering finance, either directly or through partners. And in fact, the two enterprises that mentioned this as an obstacle were the two which were selling higher value goods and not offering financing. So this indicates that those financing schemes are working where they're in place and that there is a need for them where they're not in place. So these are the key findings from the research. In the report, we have made recommendations about how donors, policymakers, investors, sector system providers can use these findings to inform their work. But I will now hand back over to Paul and the panel for a full discussion on that.
Thank you, Emily. That was, well, you can all read the detail in the report. It's a very important piece of work. I would like to introduce, first of all, Chhavi Sharma, who is the International Program Manager at Ashden. She runs Ashden's support program for its international winners, which are organizations delivering energy access in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. This support is delivered through partners and can consist of technical assistance or introductions to finance. On my left hand, Charlie Miller, who is the partnership manager at SolarAid, a leading international charity that provides access to clean, affordable solar lights through their for-profit subsidiary Sunny Money. That's not funny money, Sunny Money. Working in Kenya, Malawi, Tanzania and Zambia, and Sunny Money is the largest seller of solar lights in Africa. Then to the far left, Ben Good, who is the CEO of GVEP International, an NGO working to alleviate poverty in developing countries through increased access to sustainable energy. GVEP supports the development and growth of small and medium-sized enterprises that deliver energy products and services to the poor. And then finally on the far right here is Eugene Amuzin, a Senior Vice President at Citi Microfinance. Eugene works with microfinance institutions, social enterprises, non-profits, multinational companies and investors to structure banking solutions that enable low-income communities to benefit from essential products and services. So there's a lot of expertise behind this table, and I'm starting off with a question for Chhavi. I don't think Ashden needs much of an introduction here. We probably are all familiar with Ashden, but what did Ashden learn from the research and how will you apply it to the support you provide to your winners?
Thanks, Paul, for the introduction. At Ashden, what we do is we work to expand energy access and the use of local sustainable energy worldwide to bring sort of social, economic and environmental benefits. And what we do to support the work is we help organizations and enterprises scale up and replicate their work. It's interesting to see the results of the research because we sort of match the enterprises working with sort of support providers, and to see sort of such diverse enterprises doing sort of a range of different sort of renewable energy work, all sort of coming at it from different points of view, but we've arrived at sort of the same conclusions, which is interesting for us to see at Ashden. Our focus has always been on investment, be it debt or equity. We've really sort of pushed organizations to get the financing they need to expand. But I don't think we have looked at working capital. We haven't given it as much importance as I think we should sort of going forward. As we know, sort of working capital is really important in terms of cash flow for organizations. It can be provided really simply in terms of lines of credit, and organizations need it in the short term to sort of produce their products, to get the products from sort of their factories into the field. So I think that's something that we definitely need to sort of emphasize more as an organization. The other thing that has been a learning is sort of the need for speed in terms of due diligence that investors do, and the analysis that they do and the time it takes to do that, and the due diligence in proportion to the actual value of the investment, because we found that the value of the investment sometimes is quite little to the amount of due diligence that is done and the amount of time it takes. As Emily mentioned, it takes sort of months and months to sometimes do due diligence for an amount that is not that significant. So I think those are the sort of, two big learnings where finance is concerned. I think the third thing which is important for us is providing independent and impartial advice on sort of financing options or sort of becoming investor ready, And I think maybe we need to start looking at doing that a little bit more in-house, or looking to work with more support providers who actually can fill that gap. As far as technical assistance is concerned, I think we have learned that the time that is needed for a sort of technical assistance placement to be really successful is sort of, a few months and not sort of 10 days or 2 weeks. And I think we are working in partnership with organizations like Challenges Worldwide, where we put sort of mentors sort of in the field for about 2 to 3 months. And I think that has just proved that that is more effective than a consultant going out there for a much shorter term. The other thing that I think we've learned is in terms of support for sales training, and also supporting HR needs from the report, and also working with our enterprises that kind of say that mid-level managers is where they really feel the crunch. And I think that is quite sort of interesting. So I think those would be the key things in terms of Ashden.
Thank you very much. So I'll turn to my neighbor on the left here, Charlie. The research showed that when an enterprise grows out of a charity, a lot of support is often needed. This is how Sunny Money came into being. What challenges did you face, and how did you overcome them, and what support did you have?
Thank you, Paul. I guess the first thing I would say is that Sunny Money was born out of probably the last 2 big flexible corporate grants before the financial crisis. We won 2 7-figure bids from Barclays and Man Group, and these donors were extremely flexible. So what did we do with the money? We took a lot of risks. We tried lots of different things. We failed repeatedly. And then one day on Mafia Island in Tanzania, we had to get rid of some stock really quickly, and one of the staff, Victor, a Kenyan guy who still works for us, he had this idea of going and talking to the head teachers to see if the head teachers could help us promote lights to the parents of students. And that was a real kind of light bulb moment, because in one day we sold more lights than we had sold in 3 months. And I think there was a realization that this was a pivotal moment. But it came about because of that flexible funding, that flexibility that our donors gave us to fail and to innovate and to take risks. Why did working through head teachers to promote lights to the parents of students work? I think the insight there is that trust is critical to encouraging people to buy a light. Even at $10, a lot of people are making a choice between buying a light and having as much food as they would ideally like. 95% of our customers live below the poverty line. So risk and trust are really critical issues, and the head teachers are trusted members of their local communities. We wouldn't be able to work with them in the way that we do if it wasn't for the NGO brand. So I think that's a really fascinating point, that when we're talking to the Ministries of Education, we're talking about SolarAid and our social mission, and what we're trying to do through a 100% owned subsidiary, which is a not-for-profit enterprise. It's for-profit, it's run fully as a business, but it's 100% owned by the charity, and all eventual profits will be recycled in pursuit of the social mission. And that is crucial to the trust that is implicit in the partnership we have with Ministries of Education. And finally, just to echo something that came out quite strongly in the research, working capital became a huge constraint for us. As we grew, as the volumes of sales grew, every single last penny we had was tied up in stock, which if it's sea freighted, takes 3 months to come from China to Africa. And we spent 2 years, we invested a tremendous amount of time trying to find working capital without success. I'm happy to say that now we have been able to do so, but the working capital need continues to grow, so we will be back on the hunt in the near future, I should imagine. I think that's it in a nutshell.
I'm sure that gives rise to a lot of people recognizing issues or wanting to follow up with questions, and we'll come to that, so bear with us. We want to work our way through some of the questions that we've prepared beforehand. But for Ben, the research showed that some enterprises feel there is a need for more independent advice, both on accessing finance and reaching investment readiness. Is it really the case that this doesn't exist, or is it just that enterprises don't know where to find it? Who could or should be providing it?
Thank you. I think it's quite a challenging question to be asked to make some very sweeping generalizations. The work that GVEP does, mostly in East Africa, involves some really quite substantial businesses, some of them involved in distribution of essentially household appliances, solar lanterns and cook stoves and things like that. Some involved in development of some more asset-intensive small installations to address energy access. And then some of them aren't very big at all. There'll be effectively 1-2 people working in a rural environment and in the informal economy on a business that might be involved with helping with solar charging or involved in production of clay liners for cook stoves or something like that. So the universe of enterprises involved in expanding energy access is hugely diverse, and that makes this a slightly difficult question to answer. But I think it's probably the case that one needs to have a little bit of a kit bag when we start the conversations with enterprises and work out really what the needs are. And for many of the businesses we work with, the issue isn't having the expertise to talk to capital, because they've got people in the management team who are perfectly competent at that. But they may well have other gaps in the armory. Of course, some may not have any gaps at all, in which case it's a nice cup of tea and we move on. But it is important to try to put the pieces together in a reasonably integrated way. I know from my own experience in the corporate sector, having investment bankers come into to my business, very often the conversations, if you've got a decent corporate finance advisor, aren't really about your financing story. They're about the essential elements of what makes your business add value to your investors, and that's really, the guts of the operation. So you have to provide a reasonably horrible word, holistic approach in many of the conversations to work out what the needs are and then address them. To the specifics of your question around sort of the value of having independent advice that is not associated with particular sources of capital, well, that must be true. You want to know, if you've got somebody sitting in the meeting room with you, that if he's advising you on your next equity raise, he's not also representing somebody who will do better for you, accept this level of dilution versus that level of dilution. So clearly it's helpful to know that he's batting on the same side as you are. And I think it is also true that this is an area where there is a bit of a market failure. So many people in this neighbourhood can work for success fees or work for equity or something like that on their transactions because there's a good chance they'll come to pass and everybody will get rich as a result. Really, we're in a market where it's a lot less liquid, and therefore the capacity to pay out of existing cash flows isn't there, because as we just heard, these are cash-starved businesses. Equally, the capacity to provide the services on some kind of risk basis is a pretty scary business model in this market. And so it isn't surprising that people struggle to find good sources of financial advice. Happily, nearly all the work that GVEP does in this area is funded by international donors, and therefore we can offer it on a free at the point of use basis. I think, I can't remember if it was in the question or not, but we often debate internally whether that means that the advice will be necessarily valued and properly used by the people receiving it. Well, that's down to quality, and part of the presentation across the general TA area said, if it's free but no good, it's a waste of time, basically. So you have to do a decent job of it, clearly. Sometimes we find our advice is not acted on for good reasons, and sometimes it's not acted on for less good reasons. But in general, I think you can see a distinctive added value. When you go into a business, for example, as we did recently, a briquettes business who said, we need help raising 200,000 in the local banking market. You spend a few days with that client and discover that actually they could recut it and only required to raise 75k and achieve their same business objectives. Clearly you're adding value. And I think that would bring me to just my last point. I don't think it's very easy to say, well, there is a set amount of time that's required to make an assignment good. Because that was an assignment that took 10 days and was very valuable. Equally, in some of the longer-term mentoring programs we do with the sort of rural micro-entrepreneurs, we're with those clients for multiple numbers of years. So again, it's kind of horses for courses.
And I think within that there's a recognition that the whole alternative energy sector has grown tremendously, and we can talk about enterprises employing many employees, but I was thinking of what I've seen in Nairobi. So the two guys in a little stall where they use the cutoffs of solar panels to charge mobile phones. That's an alternative energy enterprise, and I think we deal with a whole variety. So that makes it quite exciting and challenging as well, of course. Last but not least, Eugene, finance. The research shows that many of these enterprises are struggling to get enough finance. What needs to change for more investors to support these type of enterprises?
Sure. Thanks, Paul. So let me just, I guess, try to add a banker's perspective to all this. And we come from a microfinance background, and that's probably a good starting point for reflection. And so we've been, since 2005, working commercially with microfinance institutions, now working with about 150 microfinance sector clients in nearly 50 countries. You know, if we think about what happened with microfinance, before banks started really lending to microfinance institutions, there were other debt providers. So there were specialized investment funds, for example, that provided the first rounds of debt experience and debt capital to these institutions. And it was really after that banks came in and helped to scale the MFIs. So that there's a gap, right? Because those types of debt providers aren't, up until recent developments, haven't really been around for social enterprises, including energy providers or energy product providers. Now, couple that with the fact that these companies are fairly new, and in that context, they're not bank ready yet, and these are new business models. And these companies have grown very fast. I've seen a statistic earlier this week, something along the extent of the sales of lighting systems increased by 250% from 2010 in Africa. So when you put all those factors together, the fact that there's a funding gap, as highlighted by the stories weaved together in the report, isn't really surprising. Now, on the upside, there is certainly a growth in social finance, inclusive finance, impact investment, whatever you want to label it, and that spans a number of different sectors, whether it's water and sanitation, healthcare, education, energy, agriculture. And looking at that, I do think energy providers have an advantage over the other sectors. I think they are more scaled than some of the others, so they're probably more ready for that type of capital. They're also, it's also a physical good. It's not a service, so the manufacturing shipping process lends itself more to financing. And I think there's certainly a number of initiatives out there now that are just about either recently launched or about to be launched that will provide the needed capital to energy companies. A good example is, I'm not sure if Shell Foundation is in the room, but they've about to launch a fund with a fund manager that has come from, also cut its teeth in microfinance on a $30 million fund. And so we have a partnership, an inclusive finance partnership with OPIC, which is going to go live later this year, and also going to provide, aim to provide capital to providers of low-income goods and services. So I do think things are moving in the right direction, and therefore the report is quite timely because something can actually be done about it and is being done about it.
Thank you. With that, we can open the floor now for other questions, but I know there is so much expertise in the room that if you, from where you sit with your organization or company, has a specific response to any of the questions that was raised here, and you can add to the common understanding of the challenges, then do feel free to speak to that as well. So I would like to invite you all to indicate if you want to ask a question or you have some additional perspectives to offer. And if you don't all come at the same time, then I can try to manage it from this side. Please do introduce yourself and what organization you represent so that we can... Yes, there's a...
Ben Garside from the International Institute for Environment and Development. Thank you very much. It was very interesting to hear about the interviews that went on in the report and from the panel. One of the things that we've been working on that we see coming out in the research that we're doing is the sorts of things that Charlie was talking about building those levels of trust and the types of social cultural factors that really influence whether that trust is built. And the other types of factors within the social cultural context that influence whether an enterprise model is a success are quite important. I wonder whether within the interview process, and I don't know, Chhavi, if you're the best to comment on whether it would be Emily. Well, I noticed that it was very good to see some of those other factors within there, and there's of course the sort of more formal things like the policy environment. Whether some of those were sort of less tangible factors like building trust and the way that influences the actual business model came out, because often those things aren't articulated very explicitly.
Would you like to comment, Emily?
The one thing related to trust that did come up a few times was the issue of counterfeit products and whether or not they undermine trust in the whole industry. I know it's been a big issue in solar lanterns, for example. But the sort of issues that Charlie was talking about having more trust in an NGO with an overtly social mission versus trust in a business didn't come up particularly in the interviews that we did. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Do you think that, just to follow up slightly, do you think that could be sort of subsumed given the sort of language within things like a desire for better sales and marketing, for example?
Yeah, I mean, quite possibly. I think the structure of the way this was done was very much from you're operating in an enterprise type way, and that's how this kind of goes, as it were. And it was all done from that perspective and with that sort of language. So it could well be that those are issues which didn't come up in the interview process.
Thank you. There's a hand at the back of the room, yes?
I'm involved with Cambridge Education, who are running a project funded by DFID called Deepen in Nigeria, looking at schools. So there are 18,000 schools in Lagos providing primary school education to 70% of the primary age population. So these schools are all privately owned, but SMEs. And what we did there was we quantified the working capital, stroke borrowing, stroke finance requirement, and the other technical assistance requirement of these schools as small and medium-sized enterprises, and quantified that opportunity at $3.2 billion in terms of the unmet demand. And then we engage with the formal financial sector to say, this is the opportunity, are you interested? And we had 19 out of, say, 30 financial institutions say, yes, we want to be part of doing something in this space. So my question is, have you quantified the market opportunity of financing these energy enterprises? And have you thought about engaging with the formal financial sector in these markets to see whether they could actually play a role, not only in providing finance, but also on the CSR side, because what they actually sometimes do is provide their CSR budgets, some of the technical assistance support.
Wow, is this a question, Eugene, that you can handle, or?
Well, I do think, and Emily may correct me if I'm wrong, but I do think the report does put a number on the size of the market. And if this report doesn't, I'm pretty sure I've seen it somewhere before. But I wouldn't know what that number is off the top of my head. I think one of the things I would generally recommend is engagement with formal financial institutions, banks, as early as possible. Usually when we get a request or when we learn about a funding need, it's sometimes from an organization that we just don't know. And usually at that time, it's that level of engagement is probably a bit too late. What you want to be able to do is engage with the bank or funding providers as early as possible before you even have a funding need. And sometimes what we try to do is develop relationships over really a number of years. Say, look, well, we can't really work with you now, but let's see how you get on over the next couple of years. So I think any dialogue with formal financial institutions in regards to funding is a good one, if not in the short term, then certainly in the long run.
Ben, you wanted to come in on that question?
I think there are a lot of numbers around about the capital requirements of expanding energy access. Again, it is a very much more varied, heterogeneous pot than I venture to guess taking schools are. Schools are all roughly the same, with roughly the same sort of financing capital requirements, I guess. Here we're talking about everything from very early stage equity to expansion equity to some working capital on an established business that's essentially about inventory financing to some asset financing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a big number, but it breaks up into lots of bits for different sorts of capital provider, I think. There is quite a lot of work going on trying to identify particular arrangements that might support different aspects of that financing requirement. So what Eugene mentioned in his earlier answer on the Shell Foundation is one. We do some work on providing basically cash-backed guarantees so that SACCOs and MFIs can lend to the very small-scale energy entrepreneurs of $1,000 a pop or something like that. We're also working on a bigger loan guarantee facility that is going to be worked with USAID's Development Credit Authority, where provisionally that is sized to between $20 and $30 million across 2 countries in East Africa. So I think there is increasing amounts of interest in finding ways of engaging the proper financial sector into these markets, and those are just a couple of small examples.
And Charlie, you want to add to that?
Compared to a lot of energy access industries, off-grid lighting is probably one of the more advanced ones. I mean, it's growing 90% year on year in Africa. That's tremendously exciting, and I think investors are catching on to that. We've seen tens of millions of dollars coming into the sector in the last 12 months or so. And just to echo your point, Ben, about the diversity of needs, some of that has been for solar light companies that sell very cheap products, others for full solar as a service models where repayment is indefinite, just like it is with a power provider in the UK. And similarly, the industry is being quite proactive in trying to reach out to commercial finance. I've been involved in the Global Off-Grid Lighting Association, which has only been running a couple of years. And one of the top things that they wanted to work on was attracting investment to the sector. So the week after next, actually, we're going to be launching a study on investing in off-grid lighting, which has its own set of numbers amongst the many sets of numbers. And is deliberately designed to generate interest in this market and to make people understand that an entry-level light is not an end in itself. We have an entire energy escalator here. Once people have basic access to energy, they will use their phone more, and they will be interested in things like energy-efficient TVs and radios. And it really is a tremendous consumer good market revolving around light, access to information, access to finance, and access to the internet.
Thanks. There's a question. Yes, sorry.
Sorry, I'd just like to pick up on something Ben said, and quite encouraging actually in terms of actually providing guarantees. And just mixing that together with the beautiful chart in the report that showed, who provides guarantees. And in the report, at least it looks like the experience has primarily been with state aid agencies, which is great, and they certainly have to date been the primary drivers and providers of loan guarantees, but they shouldn't necessarily own the domain. And so we've worked with foundations on providing guarantees for funding agricultural pump companies, for example. And so that's great, and I think any pragmatic donors or social investors should look at guarantees as one vehicle of actually catalyzing their funds and enabling banks or other commercial investors to come in.
Thanks. You were very eager to come in, so please do.
Thanks. I'm Aaron Leopold with Practical Action. I just wanted to build on something that Charlie mentioned, and that's that I had to look through this morning as well, and the recommendations are excellent. I just wish that there was kind of more of a mix within the companies that were looked at, because when you're dealing with access enterprises, you have a whole scale, the sliding scale, as Charlie said, of different companies working on different forms of energy, and energy for productive uses like a hairdryer for a salon or a mill, or anything that requires more power than a solar panel can deliver, for really productive uses, for uses through which someone can earn a lot of money, or money period. You need more power. You need the beginnings of a microgrid or a mini grid, and these are things that are much more challenging to finance. As Charlie mentioned, there are tens of millions of dollars going into commercial non-subsidized loans for the Pico solar sector at the moment. And this is something that's still 10 years out probably for mini grids. And so I think a great follow-on to this would be to do some more research into, where is the money for the real energy poverty alleviation going to come from? Kind of this, when we're talking about different levels of energy access, we need to really recognize that these types of companies are offering access to kind of the lower echelons of access. And it will be a very long time before someone with a solar home system will be able to flick on the switch and cook their food with electricity, for example. And that doesn't necessarily have to be the goal, because we have clean cooking options in other ways. But there's a lot more to energy access than some of these companies represent. And I think the financing challenges there are so monumentous that it's somehow daunting to really talk about, but still they're quite important.
But I'm very excited that we're talking about this as the challenge that it is, because I don't think it's that many years ago that we are still talking about how do we get to the basics. So maybe 5 years from now we'll have a conference or a meeting, we're launching a report about sustainable transport. Who knows? We might get there ultimately. There's so much happening in the technology front, and the financial sector is coming on board as we see. We need to challenge, we need to put the things out there, and we need to make people understand that it is not just sort of we're aiming for the lowest level. We actually want to be part of something that's hugely exciting. Who else would like to come in? Here on the front, and then maybe first the lady here on the right, and then I'll come to you. Yeah.
This is Emma Wilson from IIED. My question to the panel is, there are roles for private investment and there's roles for public finance and charity donations and so on. There's a lot of expectation of the private sector to be delivering finance. But what do you think about what are the limitations of private investment? And I just would be quite interested to hear your views on that.
The limitations on private investment. Well, maybe who would like to?
Yeah, I mean, I'll take that one. I mean, I think there's appropriate levels of capital at different times, and so bank capital is probably most appropriate when you have a sustainable organization that is really looking to scale. Because at that point you need an organization that's going to be disciplined in servicing its debt, and really has realistic numbers that it's looking out 6 to 12 months and so on. Prior to that, what this sector has available to it, unlike mainstream industry, is softer money from whether they're social investors or donors. And I think there's certainly room for that. And obviously there's never a black and white, so it's always a gray and usually blending, and we think of it as really a graduation curve.
Yeah. Anyone else who wants to come in on that?
I think I was more or less going to say the same thing. Quite a lot of what we try to do is to find ways to put the soft money and the donors' money in as some sort of pioneering capital, either to prove something out so that the next time they need money they've got a good story to take to the bank. You know, these are the default rates we've experienced, so now it's a bankable proposition or whatever. Sometimes it's about being alongside, but obviously taking a different risk return position so that the private money that's in there has got a chance of being raised. You know, I think it's quite interesting when you look at the economies, the countries where these businesses generally are making the bulk of their money. It is in places where there is something approaching a more developed market economy with rule of law and so on. Not all as we'd like it to be, obviously, but there are many places which make up their big contribution to the 500 million in sub-Saharan Africa, where some of these things are much less well developed, and therefore you're going to find it much harder to find private financing options.
Good. The gentleman here.
Thank you. My name's Andrew Scott from the Overseas Development Institute. I've got two questions, if I may. The first is a little bit trying to understand a little bit more about what's going on. And congratulations to Christian Aid and Ashden for organising such a stimulating event. And obviously I, unlike one or two others here, perhaps haven't read the report yet. But what is curiously going through my mind a little bit is the kinds of challenges that are presented were, to my mind, anyway, at first sight, the same challenges that all small enterprises face in developing countries. And so the question that goes through my mind, was there anything specific to energy-type enterprises that came out of the research? Because if it is the same kind of challenges that are faced by small enterprises, it does raise questions about what kind of support and which kind of organisations should be providing support, particularly if you're thinking from a donor perspective. My second question is a little bit more specific, and picking up on Chhavi's point about due diligence, and whether or not you have any recommendations about what to do about that particular challenge, because it is one that is potentially faced by not just the kind of enterprises that we're talking about here, but the kind that Aaron is talking about, perhaps even in a bigger way. And whether this is just an inevitable factor of the fact that we're dealing with perhaps sometimes concessional finance or supported finance, or whether there are things that can be done to take away that burden.
Chhavi, would you like to have a stab at trying to answer that?
Sure. I think in terms of your first question about what is sort of specific to energy access enterprises, I think you're right in saying that most of the challenges faced by energy access enterprises are also faced by other SMEs as well in the different sectors. The one thing that sort of I have noticed working with sort of Ashden enterprises is in India, for example, where we have a collective of Ashden Award winners working together, we find that in the beginning they found it very difficult to get any kind of financing from commercial banks. India has a list of priority sector lending items, and you need to sort of, energy access or energy wasn't on that list. So working together as a group of, Ashden sort of winners, they managed to get energy on that list. There were other items that were on that list that applied to other SMEs, so the SMEs could apply for financing. So that is something that I've seen that in different countries where financial institutions or commercial banks are not really, they don't know much about energy, they're not aware of energy, whereas agriculture is fairly straightforward. If you're looking at health, that's fairly straightforward. They're much more willing to sort of invest than they are in energy, purely because I think a lack of awareness. And then, of course, there's a risk factor, but I think that that's almost number two. The first thing is just a lack of awareness. In terms of your second question, sorry, can you just remind me what that was? The due diligence thing. I think, again, what we've noticed working with Ashden Award winners is that sometimes the commercial institutions do less due diligence than some of the social investors or the private sort of investment funds do. And I think that is something that social investors need to become more aware of, and then sort of know that they're taking up sort of time and money from diverting time and money away from the sort of core purpose of the business. And I think that's something that long term, I think, as in this sector, we need to sort of look to influence a little bit, but that's obviously much more challenging to do.
Yeah, my comment on the due diligence side is, I mean, different types of investors, whether it's a foundation, a fund, a bank, and a development agency, are going to have different processes, and you could probably bucket them. And once you as an organization have gone through one turn with each type, then the next time you do it becomes that much easier. So I think to a certain extent, it's experience of these companies going through the due diligence process.
So if you don't mind, I would like to give the gentleman a chance to ask his question, and then we wrap it up.
Yeah, I've always had a bit of a problem understanding what is the definition of clean energy. Because there was a French writer who wrote about the connection between mineral fibers, where's the material source for the wind turbines, and products like mobile phones. So my question is, with regards to these disruptive fibers that source for these clean energy products, a lot of the finance seems to me be going to generating energy in these developing countries from sources that are not so desirable. But what about in terms of food sources? That I think is quite a big issue. They get the energy, which is clean, possibly. What about something a lot more sustainable, and is there any finance going into that? Most of the finance I see is going into promoting and pushing genetic modification and lighting. So is there any finance or investment going into something that they can actually produce, consume themselves from this clean energy?
Can I take?
Yeah, can you try that one? It's quite a complicated one.
No, it's a really important point. We have to acknowledge that there are rare metals in renewable technologies. Some of them are really bad for the environment if you throw them away. And maybe sometimes we do oversell the PR in terms of, you know, the environmental sort of, you know, the angelic environmental goodness of the renewable technologies which are used. But I think it's pretty much, you know, it's very hard to argue that renewable technologies such as solar and wind are not infinitely preferable to coal and oil and the sort of fossil fuels that dominate energy markets today. So if we can transition to renewable energies, it'll be a step in the right direction, even if it's not perfect. Equally, I think with off-grid lighting, it's a really it's a great opportunity to build a market which takes things like repair, reuse, recycling, and the concept of cradle-to-cradle wasteless value chains to the next level, really. So, you know, we're doing everything we can to ensure that we don't produce waste. And when you're building a new industry, it's much easier to demonstrate what's possible as the industry grows compared to trying to change a very established industry like transport. So I guess, you know, we should hold our hands up a little bit and say, no, these technologies are not perfect for the environment. They still have their issues, but they're a big step in the right direction. And, you know, with building some of these markets, we're really hoping to set some positive examples about the kind of wasteless value chains that the future really needs.
And on that very positive, challenging and profound comment on the honesty factor that we need to keep in mind when we are promoting something that seems innately good but may have its downsides as well. But we have an opportunity, it's a new sector, it's something that's developing, and I think that's a wonderful moment for us to draw this to a close. So I'd like to thank my fellow panelists here for the wisdom that they were able to share with all of us. Another, once again, word of thanks to Simmons & Simmons for hosting us all, and in general encouragement to everyone in the room, donors, investors, technical experts, policymakers, to engage with the recommendation of the report. Take them back, discuss them with colleagues, disagree with them, write to us, engage in a debate, so that we look at how you could do things differently and we look at how we can do things differently. We need appropriate financial and technical support, and enterprises need that badly. Energy poverty will only be ended through an enterprise-based mechanism. It won't come from charity. We need energy enterprises to thrive with all the challenges that will bring, but also all the excitement that is possible.